My name is Marlo Hood. Welcome to a new edition of the AFP Foundation's training course for journalists on climate change and sustainable development. From its post-World War II origins, the modern environmental movement has been pitted, in the minds of advocates as well as their detractors, against the pollution-belching engines of growth that powered the industrial world into prosperity. The first laws to police and protect water and air quality in the 1950s, the realization that pesticides used on crops and against mosquitoes were also poisoning plants and the people who ate them, the establishment in 1970 of Earth Day in the United States. Throughout this trajectory, efforts to protect the environment and the creatures that inhabit it were seen, and sometimes cynically cast, as coming at the expense of economic expansion. More often than not, it took deadly disasters and stark evidence of rising mortality from befouled air and water to enact major legislation. Even today, when none can seriously doubt the necessity of reining in what is potentially the most destructive pollutant of them all, taking action to curb greenhouse gases, for many, means sacrifice measured in lost GDP. But for reasons that we will explore here, the supposed trade-off between economic growth and environmental integrity is beginning to look like a false dilemma. A quick scan of landmark assessments over recent decades of humanity's relationship to our environment offers a revealing glimpse in the tenacity of this perceived tension between economy and ecology. In 1972, a report commissioned from a trio of MIT scientists by the Club of Rome, entitled The Limits of Growth, predicted that if global population and GDP continued at the same pace as in previous decades, humanity's collective footprint would eventually overshoot the carrying capacity of the planet. The results, they said, would be managed decline at best, even societal collapse. To avoid this outcome, both our numbers and our economies would need to expand more slowly, they said. Reaction to their sober vision was fierce. Only sustained growth, the kind we've seen in China over the last 3 decades, for example, could lift hundreds of millions out of poverty, critics said. In 1987, in a report that would lay the groundwork for the Rio summit 5 years later, another sweeping blueprint for human development called Our Common Future likewise cautioned that sustainable development, defined as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, does imply limits. It also called for the poor to get their fair share of resources, a vision of equity that many continue to perceive as a brake on economic growth. 2 decades later, as the threat of climate change began to loom large, economist Nicholas Stern, commissioned by the British government, issued a report in 2006 that calculated for the first time the cost of fixing climate change, which he estimated at 1 to 2% of GDP over a period of decades. But Stern also added an important notion, which was the cost of inaction. The longer humanity delays a retooling of the global economy to radically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, he warned, the more it will cost to tackle the problem further down the road. He compared early action to an insurance policy, noting that 1% was a reasonable price to pay. Stern's advice was duly noted and mostly ignored. 35 years earlier, the authors of Limits to Growth had predicted that political leaders would be slow to recognize and adjust to the impending reality of what today are called planetary boundaries. But with the historic Paris Agreement of December 2015, we may have finally seen the crystallization of a shift, a paradigm shift perhaps, in thinking about how to recalculate the costs and benefits of action on climate change, and how to better reconcile economic growth and the environment. There are at least 4 important ways in which this calculus has been revised and is beginning to forge the basis of a consensus, expressed in yet another report issued last year called The New Climate Economy. One is taking into account the true costs of climate impacts, which up to now have been ignored or poorly quantified. These would include, for example, the devastating toll on health caused by factors which also drive global warming, such as noxious fumes from motor vehicles and industry. The World Health Organization estimated that there are 3.7 million deaths per year, more than tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV combined, from pollution alone. Decreased food production is another so-called externality that must be added to the ledger. Scientists estimate that a jump of 1 degree Celsius could shave 6 or 7% off of major crop yields in densely populated regions of the world, especially in Africa and Asia. An increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events will bring with it a huge jump in costs, measured not just in lives lost, but damages to homes, infrastructure, agriculture, and industry. And how does one begin to calculate the economic impact of tens of millions of climate refugees wandering the globe in search of a new home? A second major factor, already mentioned, that profoundly changes the balance sheet is the cost of inaction. With severe impacts of climate change already upon us, drought, megastorms, and especially rising seas, damages that are today measured in tens of billions of euros or dollars, in a few decades could be calculated in tens of trillions. If you don't replace that broken tile today, a decade from now you'll need to replace your entire roof. In a recent update of his landmark 2006 study, Stern wrote, "The argument that the costs of inaction greatly exceed the costs of action, strong then, are even stronger now." A third crucial element that has long been undervalued are so-called ecosystem services found in nature. Life itself would not be possible without the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the soil in which we grow staple foods. And yet, this natural capital, as it is sometimes called, is mostly taken for granted. Seen as free, they are too easily abused and degraded, a phenomenon sometimes called the tragedy of the commons. But ecosystems provide a host of essential services that could and should arguably have a price. A few examples. The value of pollination services provided by wild bees has been calculated to be upward of $1.5 billion annually. Were the bees to vanish, or real possibility, much of this value would simply disappear. Humanity takes for granted the fact that oceans absorb 90% of the excess heat generated by global warming and about a quarter of extra CO2 emissions. The uptake of carbon dioxide alone, a recent study calculated, is worth more than $200 billion a year in averted climate damage. Wetlands filter polluted and dirty water so that it can be consumed by humans. Mangroves, 40% of which have disappeared in the last 2 decades, protect against storm surges. Trees provide shade and regulate air quality. The list of natural capital is as long as it is underappreciated. Finally, a fourth development, changing the cost-benefit ratio of decarbonizing the global economy, is the crossing cost curves of fossil fuel and renewable energy. A barrel of oil or a ton of coal has 2 prices. One is posted on the big boards at commodity markets, rising and falling with supply and demand. The other, more accurate price, however, would include the environmental impacts of dirty fuels. A carbon tax that reflected these true costs, something many economists call for, would make it a less attractive commodity. At the same time, the cost of renewable energies, especially solar and wind, has dropped dramatically to the point where they are competitive with fossil fuels in some markets and regions, even without a carbon tax. Many serious studies conclude that it is technically feasible to scale up renewable energy quickly, perhaps even fast enough to largely replace coal, oil, and gas by the middle of the century. For that to happen, however, political leaders will need to enact policies that better reflect the full range of costs and benefits that we have reviewed here. The New Climate Economy report calls for an annual investment of at least $1 trillion in clean energy. That's not going to happen by itself. Taken together, these changes could add up to a new vision of economic growth, one that leaves fossil fuels in the ground and invests massively in non-polluting energy. Global GDP, in other words, not only can continue to grow, but it could soar in this new climate economy. But the world is at a turning point, and many things must fall into place at once for this to occur. Take the example of India, which, of all the major economies at the COP21, expressed the most serious misgivings about the shift away from a carbon-based model of economic growth. India has enough coal to fuel a trajectory similar to China's, and it continues to invest in coal-fired energy. But at the same time, its leaders are aware of the costs for India and the rest of the world of following that pathway. They have bet heavily on solar energy at the same time. And so the country that is soon to be the most populous in the world must decide, will it be the last big fossil fuel economy or the first to leapfrog into an era of renewables? But beyond the idea of substituting one kind of energy for another or driving growth through investment rather than consumption, this moment in the human saga also raises even more profound questions. What should be the measure of progress in the 21st century? Is GDP growth still an adequate yardstick, if it ever was? Indeed, can one imagine a world where progress with a capital P is decoupled from growth and maybe based, at least in part, on an index of human well-being? That is a question for another day, though one hopes not for another century. To find out more about the relationship between economic growth and environmental protection, I spoke to Alden Meyer, who's a climate expert at the Union for Concerned Scientists in Washington, D.C. I asked him, many people believe there is some kind of zero-sum game between economic growth on the one hand and protecting the environment or fighting climate change on the other. Is that true?
It's certainly not true now. I think it's always been greatly exaggerated. I'm never sure it was entirely true, but it's certainly not true now. If you look at the analyses that are out there by the World Bank and others, they make very clear that the real threat to economic development, to prosperity, to lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty is not action on climate change, it's inaction on climate change. It's the impacts of climate change on agriculture, on health, on water supply, on storm damage. A 4 °C world would just be a horrific world which would frustrate the efforts of the global community to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, to lift people out of poverty, to provide health and water and food and livelihood to people. So I think the much greater threat is clear now. It's inaction on climate change, is the impacts of climate change.
Can you sketch out a scenario like you just described, of where it could actually make more economic sense to leapfrog, as it were, those old energy technologies into renewables?
Well, I think you see that, for example, in India now, with the Indian government putting a very aggressive renewable deployment target on the table. So this is a very big amount of power, of renewable capacity in a very short time. And I think India is realizing that it may be easier and more cost-effective for them to provide access to sustainable energy services to hundreds of millions of Indian villagers through a decentralized, renewable-based strategy than through trying to build lots of coal plants and transmission lines and a centralized distribution system to meet that need. So that's just one example of where I think you can, just like India didn't replicate the West in putting in landlines for telephones. They jumped right to cellular technology. Didn't make the huge investment in all the telephone lines and infrastructure. Similarly, I think they and other countries are poised to leapfrog the sort of fossil fuel age when it comes to, at least when it comes to the electric sector, by shifting to a decentralized renewable based system.
Nicholas Stern, 10 years ago, put out a landmark report in which he calculated how much it would cost to put the climate back into balance. And I think, as I recall, his estimate was between 1% and 2% of global GDP. Does that still hold true, or what you just said kind of changed the equation?
Well, I think Lord Stern would say, if you asked him now, that both sides of the equation have changed, that maybe his estimate of the additional cost in terms of GNP for making the transition is less than it was then because of some of the shifts in the cost of these technologies. On the other hand, I think he would say that the likely cost to GNP and the economy of the impacts of climate change are larger than he thought 10 years ago. So the cost-benefit equation has gotten even more forceful. It's much more effective to take action now than to wait and try to take action later and suffer the consequences of inaction. And I think that it was a landmark report at the time, I think a seminal piece of work trying to put in mainstream economic terms what we were dealing with here. And I think that that kind of analysis is still compelling, but I think he would be the first to say it's out of date.
So we've had a good look at the relationship between the environment and economic growth. Here are a few tips. In some ways, this is a difficult story to illustrate. Parts of it are quite abstract. But there's one part of it which does lend itself to very concrete examples, and that would be ecosystem services. Learn about them and use them as a point of entry, for example, into a story. Ecosystem services are very clear and concrete and can be easily demonstrated. Second point, related to the first one, there's a very interesting and underutilized, I would say, body of research around ecosystem services. Some of it emerges from the Convention on Biodiversity, which is another major convention like the one for climate, which again gets less attention on the global stage. In particular, you might want to look at something called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, which is a body of research looking specifically at the question of attaching a value to ecosystem services. So I touched briefly in my general remarks on a few landmark reports related to this subject, and I want to just revisit some of them here and suggest strongly that you go and actually read them or read parts of them. Perhaps the first one to look at would be the most recent, the New Economy Report, which has become a kind of touchstone for questions related to economic development in the context of climate change. There's the 2006 study called the Stern Review, written by Nicholas Stern, and then an update of that he wrote just last year in 2015 for the Royal Society. Those are all things that are worth looking closely at. Finally, if you're looking at this persistent tension between economic growth as a priority and protecting the environment on the other hand, that tension manifests itself differently in each country. And one good place to look perhaps to see how it expresses itself at a government level is between the ministry that is responsible for the environment and one that is responsible for development or economic growth. Very often within a government you'll see that tension expressed between these two different ministries. And so that's one place to look to see how that particular tension plays out in a policy framework. Here are a few points worth retaining from this particular session. So-called environmental consciousness is very new, historically speaking, and emerged in the second half of the 20th century. Like any major new current of thinking competing in the policy arena, it is met with strong resistance. Number two, the traditional way of calculating value or worth in an economy is based almost entirely on GDP growth and gains in productivity. Number three, with externalities and co-benefits, both terms you should know even if they are to be avoided for lay readers, this old calculus breaks down pretty quickly. And finally, number four, there is an even broader and fascinating debate here about the very notion of progress and the limits of capitalism as an engine for growth in an era of severe environmental degradation. Keep an eye on it.